Hi, this is Nathan Tintle. We're going to talk about what type 1 and type 2 errors mean in the context of a test of significance and talk about the consequences, and we will use the heart transplant operations data to talk about this learning goal. When we use a significance level to make a decision about the hypotheses we're testing, that is whether to reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis, it's possible we will make a mistake, and there's two possible mistakes that we could make. Here's a summary of those mistakes, which we call type 1 and type 2 errors. Now this grid is meant to show you the four different things that can happen in a test of significance. There's two decisions that you can make, as shown on the left side of this table. You can either reject the null hypothesis or not reject the null hypothesis. And then there's two things that could be true. Either the null hypothesis is true or the null hypothesis is false. Let's look at the first row. If we reject the null hypothesis, when the null hypothesis is false, that's the correct decision. We've done the right thing. Of course, if we reject the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is true, that's a mistake. We call that a type 1 error or a false alarm. On the other hand, if we don't reject the null hypothesis, our p-value is above the significance level, we fail to reject the null hypothesis, well, if the null hypothesis is true, that's the correct decision. We have correctly not rejected the null hypothesis. On the other hand, if the null hypothesis is false and the alternative hypothesis is true, then we call that a type 2 error or a missed opportunity. Let's talk about what these two errors mean in context. So a type 1 error is a false alarm. This is where we say, well, we're going to reject the null hypothesis. We've got strong evidence that St. George's death rate is more than 15%. So we're going to shut down St. George's. Well, if the null hypothesis is actually true, that is St. George's death rate is 15% just like the national average, then we might have made a mistake. We might have incorrectly sounded the alarm. The implications in this case are that we're going to potentially prevent some people from getting a life-changing surgery, a heart transplant at St. George's, or at least make them travel further to get it. The other kind of error that we could have made is called a type 2 error or a missed opportunity. This is when we say we fail to reject the null hypothesis. It's plausible that St. George's death rate is 15%, and so we're not going to shut down St. George's. If the alternative hypothesis is actually true, we might have made a mistake. We might have missed an opportunity to shut down a dangerous hospital. The implication in this case is that people might die post-surgery since the transplant was conducted at St. George's instead of elsewhere where the death rate is lower. A few words of caution. Statisticians really try to protect themselves against making mistakes through the use of language. We've talked a lot already in this course about strength of evidence. We have more evidence, we have less evidence, we have some evidence, we have a lot of evidence. That helps us from saying, oh yes, for sure that's enough evidence, I'm convinced. Another way statisticians protect themselves with language is by saying the null hypothesis is plausible. We've really emphasized this. We never want to conclude, oh, we've proven the null hypothesis is true. All we're saying is that is one of a set of plausible values. Another word of advice is that when you're drawing conclusions, it's really helpful to think about the implications of the potential mistake. So think about the context. What's more important here? Shutting down a hospital that might have an increased death rate, or keeping a hospital open even if you're not sure about the increased death rate so more people have access to heart transplant surgeries? That's a tough decision, but that does need to sort of weigh in a more subjective manner on our conclusions in this data analysis.